Hey everyone, thank you all so much for tuning in. Today we are going to be discussing some of the major changes being made to the trajectory of DC projects at Warner Brothers and how those changes could impact the future of films and video games under the DC brand. But before we get into it, as always, if you have thoughts, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if you do enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like rating to show your support and subscribe for more uploads like this one in the future. But let's get into the topic at hand. So David Zaslav is currently the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, and he has already made a lot of changes that have turned heads. Perhaps the most notable one was the cancellation of the Batgirl film, despite the fact that it had completed production. Another big recent one was bringing back Henry Cavill as Superman. But today, the change that I will be referencing the most, and the change that is the most relevant to what we will be discussing today, is the decision to bring on specific creatives to spearhead DC going forward. He has brought on filmmaker James Gunn, producer Peter Safran, and other creatives will be involved, even if they're not at the top of DC's new pyramid, like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who does seem to have some creative influence in the future of DC projects. And while we don't know how this will fare going forward, and we don't even really know the specific direction that this universe is going to go in the future, we have been given some breadcrumbs. We have heard some quotes, most notably from David Zaslav himself, who has talked about the direction that James Gunn and Peter Safran are nudging the DC label to go. And the two biggest pieces of heavy-hitting news that people are discussing pretty rampantly and already starting to get concerned over are, firstly, that David Zaslav has noted that he doesn't want 4 on-screen Batmen. He wants to make it a more cohesive, singular universe. But the other thing that has been mentioned is that the DC universe going forward will include animation, video games, and films as part of its combined universe. So in terms of that first bombshell, that he wants there to be a more cohesive take on big characters like Batman, it makes sense to me. I do understand where he's coming from. When you look at Batman in the mainstream right now, you have Ben Affleck as Batman still in recent memory. You have Joker, which is a one-off Elseworld story. You have The Batman by Matt Reeves, which is another alternate universe take on the character, which isn't connected to the rest of the universe. And you also have Gotham Knights in video games now, which is separate from the Arkham series. And I would even argue that the Dark Knight trilogy is still recent enough in memory that it would be considered a mainstream approach to the character. And as a result, I can totally understand why mainstream fans would be getting confused and maybe a little bit tired with the Batman IP, just because it keeps shifting so much and because there isn't a clear direction for it going forward. I do think that the problem that they could run into is a similar one that they ran into with the Snyder Cut situation, where you have developed a fan base for Zack Snyder's take on the DC universe, and then when you just try to remove him and go in a different direction, it causes people to be frustrated. And unfortunately, the course correction direction that they chose to go in after they removed Zack Snyder from DC was essentially to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And while it did create some really interesting creative freedom for directors and gave us a wide variety of films, you know, Birds of Prey, Shazam, Batman vs. Superman, they all feel like wildly different movies, but now I feel like the fan base is getting stretched very thin. People who are huge fans of Joker aren't necessarily going to be huge fans of what Zack Snyder did, and people who are huge fans of what Zack Snyder did are not necessarily going to be huge fans of what James Gunn did in The Suicide Squad. And so while I do think that it's a good long-term goal to sort of bring the fans all back together to support a singular vision, I think in the short term it's going to create a lot of problems and a lot of heartache among fans who don't want to see certain iterations of their favorite characters fall by the wayside, which I think will have to happen in order to generate a more cohesive direction. In terms of the other news that people keep discussing, the big mentioning of video games and animation as parts of this new DC universe has some people on edge. And I do understand why that's a concerning notion, because essentially what that would mean is that you wouldn't have another Batman Arkham situation where you have an original video game take on the IP. You'd have to, if they were going forward with Ben Affleck in the films, make a game that took place in the Ben Affleck Batman universe. You'd probably actually have to use Ben Affleck as the actor. And I do think that there is potential for that to be really cool. And in theory, I think that would be really awesome. I mean, imagine if the Batman Arkham games themselves were part of a cinematic universe. I think the problem with it is that it would limit creative freedom. I'm sure that there would be a lot of restrictions on which characters could be used for specific games. And the games would also have to meet specific deadlines in order to release during the phases of the universe that they were supposed to release. So this could lead to some video game tie-in problems that we used to have when we got tons of movie video game tie-ins, where products feel rushed, they're not given the polish that they need, and the creative freedom of the developers is heavily limited because it has to fall in the narrative parameters that have been set by the higher-up executives. I also think that you'd run into some of the issues that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been running into recently with some of their Disney Plus shows, just in the sense that not as many people are watching them. And then to tie in some of those events into the larger productions that are going to be in the films, like when the next Avengers movie starts referencing events from She-Hulk and Miss Marvel, I think that people are going to start to be confused because I don't know that they've had as big of an audience for those. If you start limiting some of the big events of your universe to video games as well, there are a lot of mainstream film fans who just don't play video games. So then you either have your video game fans who are playing games that feel kind of inconsequential by comparison to the events that are happening in the films, or you have film fans who don't play games who will just be left completely confused by what is going on. So while if the execution was perfect, it could be really fun to have a game set in the same universe as the films, I just doubt that it would be able to be carried out the way that it should be. I think that there would be too many cooks in the kitchen, and it would just result in a less than appetizing dinner. I'm sorry, that was a horrible analogy, but whatever. With all this being said though, I don't think it's time to jump on the being concerned bagwagon just yet, because we just don't know enough about it. Maybe the video games will be part of the DC universe as a multiverse story. Maybe these will be Elseworlds story. We don't know, for example, if Monolith's Wonder Woman is intended to take place in the Rocksteady Arkhamverse or if it's an original take on the character. But maybe it will be an Elseworlds take on Wonder Woman. It won't necessarily have to feature Gal Gadot as the character. Similarly, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is late enough in development. I don't think they're going to make major changes to what that game is before it launches. And especially with where Peter and James are still in the planning phases of this, there's definitely a lot of time and room for them to consider what the best course going forward will be. And if they did decide to tie video games into the cinematic universe, there's always the chance that we'll all be pleasantly surprised by their quality. And with that also being said, there's the chance that maybe it won't work out and they will very quickly allow these studios to go back to making original takes on these characters. Overall, I just don't think there's enough information to really get concerned yet, even though the results could very well lead to some disastrous video games in the DC label. But until I get more information about this, and until I actually hear that that's the direction they're going forward in, I'm not going to get too worried about this. I'm excited to check out Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I'm excited to check out the Wonder Woman game. And I do think the future could be very bright for DC. And I do just think that it is going to be an initial power struggle and uphill battle to get fans all on the same page. But once they do, I think that the DC universe has a lot of potential to be really great in films and video games. But those are my thoughts. Please be sure to leave yours in the comments below once again, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for checking this one out, and we will see you guys in the next one.